Well, it is truly an honor to have two such prestigious guests join me for Haymaker as host, the 79 years young Richard McPherson and the world's most famous chicken, Doomberg. For viewers that don't know, that you're seeing his green chicken avatar, which often includes a Bloomberg terminal. And I guess that means that you've kind of elevated Hunt and Peck to a whole new level. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's first of all, it's really great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to be here with such a great fellow guest like Richard. Is a true honor. But yeah, we're here, and I would correct you, not the world's most famous chicken, perhaps not, but definitely the world's most famous green chicken. We will
You're very modest.
We will plant our flag on that hill and defend it quite thoroughly.
Yes, you're very modest, and of course, these days being green makes you even more special. And like
ESG approved, yeah.
ESG approved, exactly. So before we start, why don't you guys, and Richard, because age before beauty, you go first and just give us a bit of background on your career.
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. I have been a student of energy since I was 13 years old. I went in the Navy nuclear power program in 1963, spent 20 years in the Navy nuclear power program, got out and went and worked in over 30 countries, represented the United States for 4 years at the International Atomic Energy Agency because of the Chernobyl accident. There was a special six-nation group that was set up there. I was asked by the State Department to be the US representative to it. It was the United States, Canada, Switzerland, UK, Spain, and the Soviet Union. We studied nuclear fuel cycle facilities, the environment, and public opinion for 4 years. I got to go to just about every nuclear reactor type in the world and everywhere they were making nuclear fuels. After that, I continued working in this field. In early 2018, I got introduced to a Dr. Paul Murata, who used to design naval reactors, and he had designed something called the molten salt nuclear battery. In the first few minutes of him describing it, he told me that it has no pumps, no valves. It's natural circulation, so I was hooked. Make a long story short, I am now the CEO of Idaho Energy, Inc., and my responsibility is to get these reactors manufactured, tested, and deployed.
Excellent. Well, we'll definitely come back and talk more about micronuclear here a little bit later in the program. All right, Doomster, what sayeth thou?
Hey, yeah, so Doomberg, I'm the head writer of the Doomberg Substack. I'm representing the team that produces our newsletter, which covers, as you know, energy, finance, and the world at large. Big fans of nuclear, but nowhere near the depth of expertise that Richard has. But having said that, we do have a slightly different set of experiences. And I personally spent a couple of years in the commodity sector as a practicing scientist initially, and then as a senior executive managing teams of researchers working on all manner of energy projects, including sort of getting more out of a barrel of oil, all the way to sort of renewables and storage and what could and couldn't be done. Our focus is more sort of on standard chemical reactions as opposed to nuclear ones. But as I'm sure you know, we've written quite favorably about nuclear power, huge fans of it, and very much actually looking forward to hearing Richard's comments about the exciting things that are going on in the industry, not just SMRs, but also microreactors and so on, and to have a very fruitful discussion.
Great, thank you. Well, it's going to be a fun and informative hour. And speaking of time, I'm going to try to keep each one of your answers to about 3 minutes, give or take a little bit. Okay, so before we jump into the body of the podcast, Doomberg, what's the easiest way for people to follow your brilliant work?
We're on the same platform you are. If you're not already subscribed to haymaker.substack.com, head over there and do that and subscribe to David's piece. And then if you are interested in a bit more, you could slip on over to doomberg.substack.com. We publish 6 to 8 times a month on all things energy. And you can also find us on Twitter at DoombergT. T is in Twitter, although I would say we have emphasized our Substack work recently over Twitter with all of the challenges going on that platform. But Substack is where you can find us and on podcasts like this.
Well, I would just say wholeheartedly and very sincerely that your missives are, that's kind of like what Warren Buffett says about Howard Marks. When one of his letters hits his inbox, he immediately reads it, stops everything else, and that's what I do almost always with yours. It's just excellent stuff. So congratulations.
Very kind of you to say. Thank you.
Yeah, very deserved. Okay, so we are here to primarily talk about small modular reactors, nuclear reactors, which not long ago, that was an area when I would bring it up, people eyes would glaze over. They would say, well, that's interesting, but it's got to be decades down the road, kind of like fusion. But that's not the case any longer. There is tremendous momentum building behind this. And I think most people are unaware, just like most people were unaware that generative AI was about ready to go viral a few months ago or early in the year. So we're going to talk about that part of it and the different iterations. And this is where Richard's expertise in particular really comes in handy. So there does seem to be, and I think this is really critical, an epiphany on the part of Western governments that small modular nuclear is ready for commercialization or getting very, very close. So maybe this is a good time for you, Doomster, to come in here and talk about the difference between SMRs, small modular reactors, and traditional light water reactors.
Yeah, I mean, I would defer to Richard for the technical details on the differences, but I would say at the highest level, in reality, the technology has long been ready. I think most of these designs have long ago been solved for most of the parameters that people care about: safety, efficiency, even cost. And I would argue that the sea change that is needed and that we are beginning to see is a sea change of politics and regulation. I actually think, when environmentalists argue that nuclear power is, quote, too expensive and takes too long, they spend all of their time and money and resources on trying to delay the deployment of these technologies and trying to increase the cost of them by clogging up the legal system with various, frivolous lawsuits to try to stop the deployment of nuclear energy, because at their core, we believe they're ultimately Malthusian pessimists who are short the human endeavor and short the human innovation potential. And I think that for decades now, the prospect of large modular reactors, small modular reactors, micro reactors, I think this technology is a solved problem. And this is where I would sort of bristle at the fusion proponents, because I sort of view fusion as a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. We have a solution to abundant, clean, carbon-free, limitless baseload power. It's called fission. We know how to do it. We know how to do it safely. There are a few challenges. Like all technological options, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. But when you measure the real trade-offs, not the invented ones or the phantom trade-offs that are concocted by these environmental extremists, nuclear comes so far ahead of all other technologies that to me, it's just a no-brainer. And I would say the sea change that we need and we're beginning to see is political and regulatory, not technical.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, even though I'm not nearly at the level that either one of you are. But I think that regulatory issue is critical. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, was established in 1974, and I believe there's only been one project. It's two plants, Vogtle and Georgia, which after years of delays and billions of cost overruns are finally coming online. But the only other one prior to that, I believe, was the Tennessee Valley Authority that came online 6 or 7 years ago. But that had actually been under construction prior to the NRC. So I've sort of joked that the NRC should have an anti in front of its name, because they do seem to be very anti-nuclear and a tremendous impediment. And it sounds like you would concur with that basic assessment.
Yeah, so I think if you look at the history, when people say it takes too long or nuclear won't be solved in time to impact climate change, it's all malarkey, as the president would say. Just look up in Canada, in the early 70s, they every year for 20 years installed a new CANDU reactor. They were able to do that, 20 gigawatts of power over 20 years, one a year. That was with technology that was 50 years old, 50, 60 years ago, they were able to do this, and the only thing that has changed between now and then is the ever encroaching and silly nature of the regulatory regimes. Like, how many nines in the safety equation do we need to solve for before we decide that we've taken enough risk off the board, right? But it's kind of like Lucy with the football with Charlie Brown. This is why just engaging in the debate at all is losing, because this is what they want you to do. The whole nuclear waste issue, we like to say in our writing that if you believe nuclear waste is a problem, you're either a victim of propaganda or a knowing purveyor of it. And for those that are well-versed in the industry, then they are the propagandists. And for those that are just afraid of it, they've been taught to be afraid. And that's a far easier problem to solve, by the way, than the technical breakthroughs needed to make fusion commercially viable. And I think fusion is just a knowing distraction to take our eyes off the real prize, which is here. And I'll close by saying our good friend Josh Wolf likes to say that if fission was invented today, it would be hailed as a civilization-saving technology and would be rushing to implement it post-haste. It was invented 70 years ago, 80 years ago. Nobody knows better than Richard. It can be, U.S. Navy has an unblemished safety track record in these microreactors. I can't wait to see the technologies that the military has perfected and that they're eventually willing to let the rest of us enjoy the benefits of. It's a really amazing time.
We'll get into that. It's a very good point that you're raising about the long and unblemished safety record of the U.S. Navy with nuclear reactors. This is a good time to have Richard address this issue of the difference between SMRs and LWRs, so small modular reactors, light water reactors, and then also to contrast SMRs versus molten salt nuclear battery / reactors, which is something I think that even Doomberg would like to learn, because that's an area that I think has the most promise of anything I've seen. So take it away with that, Richard, please.
Well, first of all, we can stop right now because Doomberg just laid it all out as to where we are today. Not necessarily the reasons why, but where we are today. And I'd like to go back and go over that a little bit. During the Manhattan Project, the United States and Canada built 5 reactors. So reactors weren't new. We had designs that worked. And in 1950, at the National Reactor Testing Station, experimental breeder reactor number 1 went critical. And then in March of 1953, the first nuclear submarine reactor went critical. Both of those gave the idea to President Eisenhower and his colleagues that we should share this technology with the world for peaceful purposes. And he did that on December 8th, 1953. That immediately spurred the Soviets into action to use all their communist friends. And they immediately started pouring a bunch of money into subversion against commercial nuclear power in the United States. And they were successful by 1970. We have not made any technical advances since 1970 until we have this molten salt nuclear battery that it was designed principally by Dr. Paul Marotta. So let's talk about the differences between reactors and classifications. Light water reactors come in 2 types: pressurized water reactors and boiling water reactors. The fleet in the Navy is all pressurized water reactors. The fleet in the United States commercial nuclear industry is about 2/3 pressurized water reactors and about 1/3 boiling water reactors. Those are light water reactors. Then we get to the non-light water reactors, of which there are sodium, which has been being pushed by General Electric and trying to sell one since the 1960s, and they haven't been successful. Then you get to the molten salt nuclear battery, and that design, which was originally done as a research project at Oak Ridge National Laboratory during the 50s and 60s and into the 1970s, and it was successful. The decision was made partially politically, a lot because of funding, and also because of the strategic need for the United States Navy to put pressurized water reactors on submarines. So we've been living with a pressurized water reactor all these years. Pressurized water reactors are very high pressure reactors. The molten salt nuclear battery that Dr. Paul Marotta has designed is a low pressure reactor. So we don't have to have large forged and welded vessels. It can be fabricated in many kinds of shops. The other thing that you asked about was the difference in basically the sizes. And we talk about micro reactors. We talk about pressurized, small modular reactors, and then we talk about the larger reactors. So the larger reactors, in this country, we finally came up in the early 90s, is we had to have all 1,000 megawatt reactors. We now know that was a mistake, and we can see that in Vogtle 2 and 3. We can see that in VC Summer. Then we have the small modular reactors. Small modular reactors came about as an identification from the International Atomic Energy Agency that talked about small modular reactors are 300 megawatts or less. They've done the same thing with a classification for microreactors of 60 megawatts or less. In the case of microreactors, the molten salt nuclear battery falls into that category. In the case of small modular reactors, one out of Corvallis, Oregon, which is in the press a lot, is a small modular reactor, and the company is called NuScale Power. So I hope that kind of answers that question for you, or those questions for you.
That was good. You trigger something I wasn't planning to ask, but is there any possibility that the molten salt reactor would actually be better than what the U.S. Navy is using currently?
No, it's safer, but the U.S. Navy's pressurized water reactors is a result of constant change in design and quality. I went in the U.S. Navy program in 1963. Now let's put that into perspective. The Navy's first commercial reactor that they built, and only the commercial reactor that they built, was built by the direction of President Eisenhower in 1954, when he asked then Captain Rickover, would he help to design and put into play the shipping port reactor. So the shipping port reactor, that is a commercial reactor, was providing electricity for many years, there was really a Navy reactor's design, both from the standpoint of the design and the quality. And it was a pressurized water reactor. It also was a breeder reactor, which a lot of people don't know. So I went in the program in 1963. That first commercial reactor only went in operation in 1958. So my span of time that I've been looking at nuclear power plants in operation started only about 5 years after the first commercial nuclear plant was put in operation, and only less than 10 years after the first nuclear plant went to sea on the USS Nautilus in 1955. So my history goes way back in actual operations, maintenance, overhaul, design, everything about them.
Cool. So a question that came to mind, another one, and let's not spend too much time on this, but I think even Doomberg was referring to it indirectly, is why has the Navy's technology, which has worked so well, not been shared with the civilian nuclear power industry? And why aren't there a bunch of small modular reactors or micro reactors based on what's worked for the Navy already, producing power for the private sector?
Well, the majority of the Navy's technology has been shared with the civilian industry. That's why we have pressurized water reactors. What hasn't been shared with them is how the overall design is on our submarines or our surface ships, because they are designed to withstand a nuclear weapon going off not too far away from it. So there are things about the Navy's pressurized water reactors that have not, and there's no reason to have them in the civilian sector. But as far as the pressurized water design, that came out of the Navy and is now, like I said earlier, is used in about 66% of our plants that are in operation commercially in the U.S. today.
I would also add, David, there's a symbiotic relationship between the Navy and the civilian nuclear power industry, and that ex-Navy experts find employment in the industry, and then having a civilian industry that is familiar with technologies only helps the Navy as well. And so, there's a good reason to have some similarities in the design. And in fact, a skilled labor force to serve the nuclear power sector could very quickly become a key constraint if we were to engage in a nuclear renaissance. And so many of the ex-naval military members would be in high demand on a go-forward basis if this technology proliferates in the way that we hope it does.
Presumably some of the Navy's nuclear technology is highly classified. I'm just guessing that, but seems logical. You can disagree.
David, I'd like to comment on what Doomberg just said. You're absolutely right. The majority of the civilian operators originally came out of the Navy. As a matter of fact, in 1970, General Electric and Westinghouse wanted to get as many Navy operators on board as they could. And I was one of the many Navy nuclear plant operators that got a letter and an invitation to go to San Jose, California for General Electric and Sunnyvale, California for Westinghouse. And I went to both interviews. I was invited to both. And the interviews were exactly the same. And what they offered us was exactly the same. They didn't have a job in the nuclear industry, but they were going to pay us $15,000 a year to do something in those two companies. What we've had, unfortunately, is a downturn, not just in the Navy, but the civilian industry that started occurring in the late 80s and went through until it ran for about 12 years or so. So we have a big gap of people that are not available. Right now, General Electric is trying to hire people and they can't find them. They're just not available. So your point about we have a problem with the workforce, we have a big problem with the workforce right now. But what the light water reactors, which are currently being built, also as small modular reactors, such as the NuScale reactor, they require a lot of people on site. The molten salt nuclear battery for the molten salt nuclear battery itself for micronuclear doesn't require anybody. It will operate autonomously. The people that will be on site will be for the balance of the plant, whether it's being used for producing electricity or producing hydrogen or seawater distillation or process heat, or for, say, mostly in Europe, for heating of houses and other buildings.
Thank you. And Doomberg, you definitely touched on this earlier about the nuclear waste issue. That's obviously a hot button, literally, for a lot of anti-nuke folks. Why is it that with SMRs in general, that the nuclear waste issue is much less a problem? I realize you don't think it's a big problem with even the big reactors, but it's from everything I know, it's even less of a threat with these smaller reactors.
I would probably slightly disagree with that premise. I think, if anything, it's slightly more of an issue with SMRs, and that's why the opponents of the technology are reamping up their illogical opposition to the technology in general based on the waste issue. I'd say it's probably roughly a wash if you were going to do sort of a broad strokes analysis. But again, in the grand history of the planet, I dare you to find, or not dare, I challenge you to find a single human being who's ever been injured by nuclear waste. You'll look long and hard. Back to this, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. I mean, we have people dying in the oil patch. We have slave labor being used to create the solar panels that we all enjoy because China monopolizes key aspects of that supply chain. We have recyclability issues with wind turbines and lots of dead birds and noise and light pollution in the heartland. Like, each of these technologies comes with pros, cons, and propaganda. And I would argue that the fear that has been artificially generated around nuclear waste is the rawest form of cynical propaganda. And in fact, the industry has a lot of blame to take here because they have engaged in the debate, and projects like Yucca Mountain are so over-designed and so crazy that the public says, oh, wait, like, if we're going to do all of this for this relatively small amount of waste, there must be something really dangerous here. And the opponents of nuclear power like to conflate nuclear weapons with nuclear waste. And, a full nuclear exchange, of course, would lead to an awful lot of dead people, but a encased spent nuclear fuel 300 meters underground, someday eventually leaking through 5 layers of containment and finding its way back to the surface and then injuring somebody is so impossible. We wrote a piece on this, and I believe the title was Angels on a Pin. Like, what are we doing here, people? Like, if the planet is truly at risk, then we must make some kind of trade-off to save it. I happen to not think that the planet is in that much jeopardy, but let's take it as an axiom that we are on the cusp of a man-made disaster that will wipe out humanity and boil the oceans and all of the things that Al Gore likes to hyperventilate about. If those things are true, then the time for serious decisions is now. And I would submit that humanity's capacity to safely handle, dispose of, and ultimately allow time to neutralize the relative pittance of nuclear waste that we create versus the trade-off of the limitless bounty of energy that we can predictably and reliably and safely produce is no trade-off at all. And so just by engaging in the debate, we lose. And that I would argue among the most frustrating aspects of this is the industry's inability to see the con that they've been feeding for all these years by submitting to ever more safe designs as though the ones they had previously submitted were somehow unsafe. And it's just utter nonsense.
Which is why these projects, these big projects, are so far delayed, so long delayed, and so far over budget. But
Yeah.
I totally agree with everything you just said. The reality is a lot of people are still pretty hysterical about nuclear waste. So leading back to Richard, and from what you said earlier, and what I know is that you believe that the molten salt approach is superior to SMRs in general. And I think that's true, not particularly, but with nuclear waste in addition. So why don't you address that part of it, but also just the general superiority of molten salt design?
Let's talk about Yucca Mountain just for a quick moment. Yucca Mountain was starting to be opened in 1966. I went there in 1977. I went there in 1987, 97, and sometime after that. Yucca Mountain was over-designed, and it should be a monitored, retrievable system because the term waste came into being under the Jimmy Carter administration. The fact of the matter, the 93,000 metric tons that we have stored, it's higher than that now, around at our commercial nuclear sites is really a strategic stockpile of fuel. It's an asset. It is not a liability. Right now, it's a liability because of all of the politics and the anti-nuclear people. But the fact of the matter is it's an asset because we can recover 95% plus of the chemical heat value from the fuel that's still in there. Now, shifting to the molten salt nuclear battery, there are a number of designs that are currently on the books that are decent designs. The molten salt nuclear battery came about because the most experienced people in the country have been designing and developing the molten salt nuclear battery. Started with Dr. Paul Murata, who went to work at Naval Reactors the year I retired, designing nuclear power plants for the Navy. And he is a world-class nuclear plant designer, coupled with Dr. Richard Christensen, who's a world-class designer of heat exchangers. And then the rest of us that came from the Navy. So we have a different mindset than all of those other people. We're not out after money. We haven't gone out after money. This has been completely self-funded, except for a few investors in the recent year. The other thing is we're not a large corporation that we have a very high overhead and we have to take care of all of these congressmen and lobbyists and other people that we have on the payroll. We don't have any of that. We've ignored that and we've kept our focus on the technology itself. That means we've looked at the entire process from cradle to grave, meaning in reality from the design to what are we going to do at the end of the life of a reactor, including what are we going to do with the fuel. We're going to recycle the fuel. The fuel is going to be a HALEU fuel. It has salt and uranium. We're already designing the systems we call.
Richard, so when you say HALEU, a lot of people don't know that. So that's high assay, low enriched uranium, HALEU?
That's correct.
Okay.
Now obtaining that right now is a problem, but that's a different subject, and we don't need to talk about that right at the moment. So we're already designing what I call 2033. We're designing the processes to defuel the molten salt nuclear batteries after 10 years of operation. Pull out, once we get the fuel out, we will separate the salt from the uranium. The salt, we will clean it up and we'll use about 100% of that salt again in another molten salt nuclear battery. We're going to do isotope separation. We're going to use 90% plus of the uranium. And then we're left with a small amount of actinides, which we already know how we're going to store them for the long term. But technology, as it advances, they're finding uses for the actinides. So if you go back and go way back and you look and say, what was the difference between pressurized water reactors and the molten salt reactor experiment and boiling water reactors, you'll see that the actinides were a big problem. The actinides aren't nearly the issue that they were today. It's going to be a very small amount of them. We know how to store them, and technology is going to be driven to use more and more of them.
Okay, and maybe that's a pretty good segue into talking about the history of molten salt nuclear reactors. You touched on this a bit earlier, Richard, that this came out of Oak Ridge National Laboratories in the 60s, and actually one of the fathers of the civilian nuclear, well, I think nuclear in general, but he definitely segued into civilian nuclear power in the 50s, was Alvin Weinberg. And he was a very strong proponent of the molten salt technology back in the 60s. And there actually was an operating, I think more than one reactor, but at least one. And I think at one point he called the molten salt, what was his term for it? A mighty smooth running experiment. And because as far as I know, it did run flawlessly. And then you kind of touched on this, that there was a political battle. Richard Nixon was from California. He had some other powerful California congressmen that were with him. And the competing technology was really orienting towards California and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They lost that political geographical battle. And he warned at the time that the way they were doing it with the light water reactors, with all that pressure, that there were risks and things could go wrong with those as opposed to the molten salt. So this, I guess my point is, this is not new technology. It's been around for a long, long time. It's proven itself. This isn't pie in the sky stuff. But what you all have done is take the design and improved it and simplified it. You mentioned that you eliminate the pumps and valves, but there's got to be downsides. What is your biggest concern about why this might not be something that's really a revolutionary breakthrough in nuclear energy?
You're asking a person who has been in this industry since 1963, and I've studied it, including classified documents going back to the Manhattan Project. So when you ask me what is the downside to the molten salt nuclear battery, I don't have any at this point in time. I haven't had any for a couple of years. The molten salt nuclear battery as it exists today is about the most perfect thermal power source that the world has ever seen. Now, that sounds good, except now we have to make it actually do something that provides useful work that you can get paid for, or that has useful work that is for somebody that needs it, that in some way, shape, or form they're going to pay for. So it's got what we call the balance of the plant, which I mentioned earlier. Whether it's a turbine generator producing electricity, whether it's hydrogen generator producing hydrogen. The current technology for all of the balance of the plants that are available worldwide are not of the quality that will last for 10 years like the molten salt nuclear battery is. So in the last year, my attention has been shifted from the molten salt nuclear battery itself to working on the balance of the plant, whether it be a turbine generator, whether it be hydrogen or whatever. And we have been able to get into some people's companies, some national labs at what they're doing, and we're starting to match the capabilities of the molten salt nuclear battery up with these other technologies. Right now, I cannot tell you that there is any downside to the molten salt nuclear battery, but also keep in mind that every energy conversion technology will have waste. The molten salt nuclear battery will have waste in the form of actinides. But as I said earlier, technology is changing and starting to find uses for those actinides. And we're only going to have a very small part of them. And we do not require anything like Yucca Mountain.
Great, thank you. So let's talk for a second about Russia and China and kind of the overall nuclear renaissance, forgetting for the moment SMRs, but I will get back to that. But unlike the West, which after Fukushima went into the fetal position with nuclear power, or even worse, I mean, they basically aborted a lot of nuclear reactors that were even operating and really turned their backs on nuclear power, whereas China and Russia didn't. And as I understand it, they've used standardized designs, which make it a lot easier to get their plants into operation. Well, now you've got 60 nuclear power plants that are under construction, with about a third of them in China. Of course, no particular surprise there. But are they also, and Doomberg, maybe you know on this, are they also looking seriously at SMRs?
Yeah, so I would say if you put Germany in its own separate category, most of the rest of the world is actually reintroducing itself to nuclear power and a variety of technologies. India, for a variety of reasons, has focused on thorium because, of course, they broke the non-proliferation treaty to develop their own nuclear weapon, and so they've had to develop their own homegrown nuclear industry because they were cut off from the rest of the world's technology for many decades. Canada, took Justin Trudeau's credit, and we're no fans of his, but he has done a complete about-face on nuclear technology, and they're pushing forward with sort of next generation can-do reactor designs. A country I would point out that has really executed an unbelievable project is the United Arab Emirates, and I think their third of 4 planned reactors just went critical, and I believe they leveraged the Korean technology. There is, of course, a very good Russian design that is quite standardized that many countries have sought to adopt. My main interest in SMR technology actually is the potential for it to abate carbon emissions in the industrial heat sector, where sort of standard old reactor designs don't produce steam of sufficient quality for such utility. And a project that we wrote about recently in a piece called Gaining Steam was, in fact, this X-energy Dow design, which since we wrote that piece, I believe they've announced that they're going to implement an 80 megawatt module design, maybe even up to 4 of them, or I may be remembering that wrong, but I believe the reactor design is 80 megawatts, and it's going into their Seadrift plant. And, Dow has many energy intense petrochemical processes along the Gulf Coast that, there's a reason why NatGen cogeneration plants are so popular, because they're very efficient in converting as much of the energy into either electricity or heat, which is very useful in industrial settings. And most people would be surprised to learn that if you sort of measure the carbon emissions that the world, that humans produce from industrial steam, it's actually greater than the combination of all of our transportation and our airline industry puts out. I think it's 10% of our emissions come from industrial steam, and the sum of those, the latter two, is only 8%. And so SMRs, because they operate at a higher temperature, not quite high enough for the highest end, applications, but it can address a big chunk of that pyramid. Anywhere between 500 to 1,000 degrees C, depending on the fourth generation design that any particular SMR technology would be optimized for. I think that this is actually the Dow project, where the reactor is small enough to be housed safely within a pre-existing brownfield site that has security after 9/11 and all of those things. That could be a real breakthrough, one that we're pretty excited about. The micro reactor / battery type technologies that Richard is referring to also is very interesting. I believe it's about bringing power to where it's desperately needed and on short notice, like grid down situations, aftermath of emergencies. We just wrote about one such emergency in our latest piece, More Than Meets the Eye, about the great ice storm in Quebec, and how that might happen here in the U.S. So there's a lot of exciting things, and the thing that I'm most excited about the proliferation of SMR or microtechnology or nuclear batteries like the ones Richard is describing, is all of it serves to demonstrate to the public the utility and safety of this technology, and begins to be very powerful weapons in what is ultimately a propaganda war around the viability of this technology, the utility of it. Look, if somebody set up a microreactor a half a mile from my home, and that microreactor powered, a 4-mile radius that included my home, I would feel very comfortable living that close to one of these reactors. I mean, the Navy submariners have served on ships with nuclear reactors on the exact same ship for years. There's no evidence that anybody's ever been hurt by one of these things. This concept is really is the real battle that we need to fight. And so my main source of inspiration from these developments is the undeniable public visible demonstration of the risk to reward ratio of these things, because they're really just off the charts.
Okay, where you were going with that is important. I want to talk about that in just a few moments, but I also wanted to address a couple of things. And first of all, thank you for clarifying that's what I was really trying to say, probably a little bit in a clunky manner, that after Fukushima in the West, there was a real abandonment of or negative trend away from nuclear energy. Even France was talking about shutting down a number of their reactors, but of course, Ukraine changed a lot of that. It's really going the other way. And that's where I think that it's a pretty fascinating time, an exciting time to be involved in nuclear energy, even these larger projects. The wind has really shifted politically in their favor, which is hard to imagine from where we were a few years ago. So it's true that it's it's not just SMRs. It's a broad nuclear renaissance that's underway. I also wanted to say that you reminded me that, because you did write up favorably the X Energy Dow joint venture that you've talked about, and you pointed out in your note that you don't have any skin in the game. You're not an investor in X Energy.
Yeah. No, yeah.
So I want to point out,
yeah.
in full disclosure, that I am an investor in micronuclear. So I just want to make sure everybody knows about that. But really where I was going with this was when you were talking about Quebec and your recent note, because this is not the only one you've written on the grid. And it's one of my pet peeves about the whole, what I call the great green energy transition, is the vulnerability and fragility of the grid. And I think one of the advantages, and you guys can chime in or disagree, depending on how you feel, that this idea of kind of distributed energy that you could actually, you were saying about in your neighborhood, you can get these plants localized where they're not, you don't have to have these transmission lines. I mean, one of the huge problems with, the solar plants and the wind plants or farms is when you get those in place, how do you get that power to market? And constructing transmission lines these days is, it's just an incredible political battle. So do you agree that that's one of the advantages of the whole SMR approach, is to be able to have distributed power and avoid the grid, or at least minimize reliance on the grid?
Well, I would say it's probably more advantageous that it provides baseload, predictable, dispatchable power on a regular basis, and grid operators can count on it 24/7, 365 with well-planned maintenance shutdowns signaled well in advance. But I would also say that you could imagine taking advantage of the pre-existing grid infrastructure by placing these SMRs at locations where coal-fired plants existed prior, and you have the infrastructure there. There's no question that we have an infrastructure crisis in the country, that low energy dense solar and wind power is exacerbating this, as well as the forced conversion of natural gas furnaces to heat pumps, which drives energy needs out of sync with the way in which the grid has been crafted and optimized over the years. The sun doesn't shine at night, the wind doesn't always blow. Transformers need to rest at night, and that's when most people would charge their electric vehicles. There's all manner of real challenges to the grid stability that all gets ignored in the name of green energy. If it's green, it has no trade-offs, and if it's not approved green, it has no benefits. That is the opening gambit of the environmentalists in their efforts to transition our economy. And it's high time we stood up to those debates and expose the fallacies that underpin them.
Great. Well, one of the downsides of this nuclear renaissance is that I think there are very legitimate concerns that the U.S. is not going to have enough uranium. Now, one of the solutions to that that's been proposed that I think is kind of like fusion is thorium. And apparently thorium is more plentiful, and there are certain advocates that are very emphatic that it is the way to go. And Richard, so far as I understand, you're kind of agnostic in this regard, that the molten salt nuclear reactor can operate with thorium or uranium. But I'd be interested, because I've heard other experts say, look, there just isn't the ecosystem, for want of a better term, in place to enrich thorium, make it really usable. But how would you comment on that?
Well, in designing the molten salt nuclear battery, we have looked at all three of the basic fissionable fuels that would be available. That's uranium, plutonium, and thorium. So all of them will work in the molten salt nuclear battery. Since you're focusing on thorium at the moment, there's a lot of misinformation about thorium. I don't want to go into it all. I can tell you that thorium is not a fuel that's ready to be used. Who's doing most of the work on this right now is India, because they've got a lot of thorium. We have done a lot of work in thorium starting back during the Manhattan Project. We have a lot of information on thorium. We know how to use thorium. We know how to convert it into a usable fuel. Thorium by itself is not a usable fuel. It has to be converted into uranium. And you do that by putting it in a nuclear reactor and adding neutrons to it to make it into a usable uranium fuel. It's also, people have said that it has less waste. It can't be used in nuclear weapons, so it's not a proliferation issue. Both of those are not true. If you look at, you go back in history and you look at the early days of the use of thorium and the use of uranium, there was a large delta, the difference between the amount of waste, let's call it, from thorium and waste from uranium. And thorium looked better. Today, they're almost equal. So thorium, because of its being so plentiful in the Earth's crust, when you look at uranium and thorium reserves today, there's more uranium reserves than there is thorium reserves. The difference being, when you look at the reserves of uranium, you're looking basically at 238, but only 0.72% of uranium-238 is uranium-235, which is fissionable in reactors. So now you suddenly see a different picture. You've got at least one person that's been traveling around the country for almost 20 years talking about thorium. There are these people that find something to ride, and they try to make a name for themselves, but they don't quite tell the whole story. But the whole story is, we're not ready for thorium yet. My guess is we will be ready for thorium in about 10 years. While we're talking about when we're ready for something, let's talk about fusion for a moment. Fusion is a material science problem. We're not advancing material science like we should. And we are not, for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is we've had a downturn in commercial nuclear power, a downturn in defense, a downturn in aerospace, and a downturn in space itself. Back during the Reagan administration, we needed a material that would last under operating conditions at just over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That material is still available today, but we haven't made any advances. What we need to do is we need to shift our money from fusion into fission. We need to shift our money from windmills into fission. We need to shift our money from batteries into fission. We need to shift our money from solar into fission, so that we have an economy that we can afford to do the material science work to make the advances that we need to have higher temperature materials.
Good stuff. Anything you'd like to add to that, Doomberg?
Yeah, only thing I would say is uranium is dirt cheap. We're never going to have a shortage of uranium on a time frame that matters. And if we did have a shortage, the market signals would trigger all of the many mothballed uranium mines around the world to start back up. And if you look at the percent of the cost of operating a nuclear power plant, the uranium could go up 5 to 10-fold and it wouldn't matter. But if uranium went up 5 to 10-fold, you can bet your bottom dollar we'd be finding a lot more of it. And as Richard correctly pointed out, our nuclear waste, in fact, would very quickly become even more valuable. And we would recycle and deal with the proliferation issues that sometimes this might present. But these are all very solvable problems. And I think by the time we run out of uranium, we're going to be, all three of us will be long gone off of this planet. I can assure you of that.
Right. And I think and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, because I am the know nothing on this podcast, but it's the enrichment process that is more of the bottleneck. And Russia is quite dominant there with about
the commercial enrichment process is a monopoly of Russia currently. Let's not kid ourselves that the U.S. military doesn't know how to do this, isn't sitting on stockpiles, and that we couldn't very quickly ramp this up for relative pittance compared to the hundreds of billions of dollars we are wasting in our chasing our own tail with these intermittent renewable so-called green technologies. Richard, correct me if I'm wrong, but I see that you're nodding.
No, you're absolutely right. We just staying on the commercial side. We have enough uranium in this country for more than 200 years. Worldwide, as we know it today, we have enough for 3,000 years. If we go into breeder reactors, we have enough for 30,000 years. What we need to deal with, as you essentially said, we need to deal with the now. And the now is we need to make advancements in fission. We need to get as many fission reactors up and running as possible, not just simply to reduce the carbon load on the world, but to help the world. One of the things that I discovered in the last 5 years with the molten salt nuclear battery is I now realize there is absolutely no excuse anymore, anywhere in the world, for anybody to go hungry or for people to be dying of diseases from drinking contaminated water. It's not a technical problem, it's a political problem. That's all it is worldwide.
So on that point, Richard, how quickly do you think that you could actually get a functioning molten salt nuclear battery in operation in the field deployed?
With the current schedule that we have, we anticipate that we will have one in operation for a joint purpose between us and some other folks sometime early next year. Once we do that, we have a manufacturer that one of the differences between us and about everybody else is we already have the manufacturing process in place. And we have the manufacturing process in place to produce several of these, quite a few of these a month. And we're designing a facility now to actually build quite a few more. We're also working in another country, which is very friendly to the United States, and trying to get them to do the same thing. Both the United States and this other country have the ability to make the HALEU fuel, and they can make the HALEU fuel in a big hurry if they want to. There is not the urgency for national security that there should be. However, people are waking up to that fact, as we have done nothing to push back on China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran. And now people are saying, wait a minute, we have been asleep at the switch, and now we're in trouble. We better do something about it. And that includes making HALEU fuel. HALEU fuel was identified as a problem when I went to the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1989. And the Department of Energy already knew about it when Admiral Watkins, Jim Watkins, was the Secretary of Energy. So it was no surprise to him that we had discovered that in 1989.
Okay, so just making sure that I'm hearing you right, you could actually have first fission as soon as next year.
That's correct.
If you get the approval and you can have located someplace where it doesn't need NRC approval, which I think is part of your plan.
That's part of our plan, and that's what we're working on right now. And we made a big jump forward just a couple of weeks ago when we got in a room with a bunch of people, and we went from 4 different options to do that to 1.
Right. Well, if it's okay, Richard, one thing that we're planning to do is attach a link to this nifty video that you guys created that even a layperson like me can understand. So with your okay, we'll put that at the end of this.
Please do. We put a lot of time in that video because what we wanted to do was we wanted to talk about all energy. We wanted to talk about nuclear and weave in there where the molten salt nuclear battery fits. So I really had little to do with that video except criticize a couple of places in it. And the people that put that together are all part of the micronuclear team and the producer down in Los Angeles. And it is a great 10-minute video. I think it should be seen by every person in America.
It's very good. I like it a lot. The other thing I would suggest to the people listening to this that are probably incredulous that this could possibly be true is to Google Alvin Weinberg. And he was a great man, and how much of a believer he was in this and how he really proved it out, 55, 60 years ago. So this is definitely not smoke and mirrors kind of stuff, or just a hope for thing that's going to happen in 10 or 20 years. This has been proven. So
can I go back and comment on one thing?
Sure.
Doomberg brought up Dow Chemical. Dow Chemical is an example of what the world needs to go to. And we call that processing heat, process heat. It's not just Dow Chemical, it's all the chemical companies, petrochemical companies, all the steel mills, et cetera. They all need process heat, and they all need a micro reactor or small modular reactor that can integrate it into their systems to do that, so that they have 100% reliability, which they do not have now for power, and also that they produce no carbon. You'll see a lot that's written about carbon capture. Carbon capture right now is all being driven by fossil fuels, primarily natural gas. There's a 40% penalty, but for using that natural gas that goes away when you're using a nuclear plant.
Absolutely. So we're pushing an hour, a little bit over, pretty much spot on. We got started a bit after. So is there anything either one of you, I'll go to you, Doomberg first, that you'd like to comment on, kind of your closing remarks?
Sure, I'll just say to give the type of statistic that is both indisputable and level setting for people when we're talking about uranium and shortage of uranium and so on. On a per pound basis, an iPhone costs $2,000 and a pound of uranium is $50. And so a pound of uranium is 1/40th the cost of an iPhone, and everybody I've ever met in the past 5 years has one in their pocket. Just to give you an example of how silly some of these arguments are. Oh, there's not enough uranium. Uranium's too expensive. You know, even the people that are, pro thorium often bring out these types of canards as they champion their own particular design. We're relatively design agnostic. We're technology proponents. We do believe that energy density is, in fact, the primary metric that matters. You give an engineer enough energy density and they will create miracles. Our entire society is oriented around energy density. Energy density is standard of living. Energy density is life. High energy dense fuels are always the way to go. No society has ever spontaneously devolved to lower energy dense fuels and ended up with a higher standard of living. That's for sure. There's a reason why we've gone from wind-powered sailing ships to coal to diesel to nuclear submarines, because energy density is key. And in the military, all of this happy talk goes away when the objective is to actually defeat the enemy. And the military doesn't have time for such nonsense. And so we should take our cues from the natural progression, for example, in the sailing world, from low energy density dispersed sources to high energy density, ultra high energy density nuclear. This is the way. We will eventually get there, perhaps unfortunately after we've tried all the wrong answers, but I have no doubt that the human spirit will eventually prevail. And we will be providing life-nourishing energy from nuclear power to the billions of people in the world who so desperately need it. And with that, Richard, a big fan of yours, a real honor to be on a show with you. Really respect your decades-long career. Congratulations on your new initiative. And David, thank you so much for having me on. It was a real pleasure.
Well,
absolutely. Thank you.
David introduced me to you. I had not received from any of my friends any of your columns. And I have been reading and writing about energy since the 60s. And this is not because it's you, and it's not because it's David, but between you and David, you are two of the best writers that people can understand about energy that there is in the world today.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Probably blushing. I don't think anybody's ever connected me with Doomberg before, put me on that kind of a high level. So thank you for those overly kind comments. And thank you both very much for coming to share your comments on this. Very exciting. I can't emphasize this enough. I really think this is something that is ready for prime time. It is, its time is now. And I think it has a great shot at being the safe and carbon-free energy miracle that humanity desperately needs. And so thank you both for all that you're doing to try to change minds that have been so frozen in their anti-nuclear views, and I think so unfairly. So hopefully we'll get a lot of people that listen to this and a lot of interest in the small modular reactors and molten salt approach. So thank you both again, and we'll be in touch. And thank you
very much. It was enjoyable.
Thanks, David.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, guys.